Hi, I'm your host, Rowan Tonkin, and welcome to Being Planful, the show for FP&A leaders and planning experts. Hi, welcome to Being Planful. I've just recorded an amazing session with Robert Kugel of Ventana Research. Robert and I talked a lot about the business continuity and the trends that are emerging post-pandemic in the FP&A space and how you can gain business advantage with continuous planning. So, over to the session with Robert and myself. Hope you enjoy it. Rob, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to talking through some of these really meaty topics and some highly focal topics that we're seeing all across the FP&A space today. And so, Rob, as we get started, I'd firstly like to introduce everyone to their cup of coffee. I know we've sent everyone out some coffee for this session today, so make sure that you've got that cup, you're awake. We've got some really great stuff. And Rob, let's kick off. What are you seeing as some of the biggest planning challenges that businesses face today?
Well, I think one of the most important and overarching issues is that a lot of companies are finding that their planning and budgeting process is really unable to provide the kind of agility and resiliency that they need in a period of change. And it's been a long period of change, really. For the past 6 months, companies have had to deal with a change in outlook, a fairly fundamental change in outlook from week to week and sometimes day to day. So they don't really have a process in place that's allowed them to deal with that. They don't have a process in place that allows people, particularly the people who are running financial planning and analysis, to answer the, what if thus and such happens, and be able to do it right away, not, I'll get back to you with that. To be able to answer it in seconds or maybe minutes, instead having to take hours or days to do that. So one of the causes of that is that the planning process itself is just not set up to be able to give that kind of rapid response to a what if question. And to be able to do that, the first thing you need to do is to break down the siloed business processes, business planning processes that most companies have to do what I call integrated business planning. You need to be able to break that process down so that you can very rapidly produce an integrated set of financials, not just a budget or a P&L, but also one series that includes the P&L, the balance sheet, and especially the cash flow, because there are just an awful lot of companies that really want to know what their cash flow looks like 3 months down the road, next month, 8 months from now, under different kinds of scenarios. And so, one of the things that what's come out of our research is that companies find it challenging to be able to do that kind of scenario planning because the data that they need to be able to measure and come up with quantitative answers to these kinds of what if questions. They just don't have the data there, the data that allows them to measure trade-offs. Only 12% of the companies in our most recent research said they had all of the data that they needed to be able to do this. In fact, a majority, 60%, say they have little or no ability to measure those trade-offs. They just don't have the numbers. And I think why that's consequential in today is that the standard base case upside downside process that a lot of companies do, most companies do, it's only adequate under pretty steady state conditions. And I say adequate because, yeah, it'll do, but it isn't by any means ideal or what I think companies ought to be doing. I think they need to be able to rapidly construct and evaluate detailed scenario plans at the business planning, individual business unit level, and be able to do that, to deal with this kind of uncertainty, to run through different scenarios. And they also need to be able to do that very rapidly, so that they're not spending, so that there's no latency in the decision-making process. And so, you need to be able to do rapid scenario planning, and you need to be able to do that quickly. So that is where I think the disconnect is.
Yeah, and that obviously leads us to our next question, Rob, which as we're seeing that disconnect, what do you think that the planning and budgeting space will endure into the future?
Well, I hope what endures is recognition that it's essential to be able to do this kind of rapid scenario planning, not just under current conditions, but all the time. Because I think, well, it's essential when you're looking at 1 in a million black swan kinds of events. I think rapid scenario planning and all that goes along with that is useful even under very steady state conditions. It's the type of approach to planning and budgeting that makes the process that much more useful. If you're able to do that kind of rapid planning, it's not only useful for kind of anticipating what might happen, but it also kind of shortens the whole planning process generally. So along with building up this capacity to do this, the other thing that I sincerely hope endures is a sense of purpose that what we've just gone through will change the process. There will be a recognition that the process isn't adequate to run a company. The process is fine for creating an annual budget, putting it in a drawer and filing it away. Who cares? But it isn't good for running a business. It isn't as useful. So I really do hope that there's a change in expectations, especially at the senior levels of a corporation.
Yeah, I think
No, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's really important that, obviously we're in the midst of a very, huge black swan event, but prior to that, we were having so much rapid change in the world before that. I mean, think of the tariff crises, a lot of the socio-political changes. That was having a huge impact on a lot of industries even before the pandemic came, and the pandemic has created that accelerant. So from my perspective, I'm seeing and hearing a lot of organizations as using this as the moment to change and do exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, because again, to your point, it isn't just black swan events. We're going to go through any number of different scenarios a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, and they're all going to have potentially a pretty substantial impact on the business. So it ought to be even part of strategic planning to be able to run through different contingencies and say, well, what happens if, and how do we restructure this part of the business in the face of that? And then how does that play out, both in terms of the operating plans, but also especially in terms of financial plans?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so as we think about those changes, and obviously the pandemic has created a huge remote workforce pretty much overnight, which no one really expected. What do you see as the role of integrated business planning in supporting those remote and what I'm sure will continue to be hybrid workforces as many folks decide that they actually do want to head back into the office? I'm seeing it more and more within our organization. We have people that are choosing to go into the office as it's now open for their reasons. And obviously other people are trying to become remote full time. What do you see IBP doing there?
Well, let me first make sure that we're all on the same page of what we mean by integrated business planning. I coined this term more than 10 years ago to refer to a technology-enabled planning and budgeting process that is able to support much more rapid planning cycles, one that breaks down siloed planning and budgeting into an integrated process, one that supports a high participation, one that's collaborative, one that ultimately is action oriented. There's a business purpose to planning and budgeting. So that's what I mean when I talk about integrated business planning. I think what, Rowan, you were referring to. I think one of the benefits of integrated business planning is that you wind up with not only an agile process, but one that also aligns all part of the business. And if the business is operating remotely in hybrid modes, and you need a lot of flexibility to be able to manage a process. And I believe that starting with a planning process that operates on a single platform, if you will, a planning platform, where everybody's using the same system to do the planning, the way in which each individual business unit plans is done just the way they need for it to be done. But all of the data, all the outcomes of that plan are available to everybody else. That allows for a much more collaborative process, and it makes it possible for all sorts of people who are working remotely, organizations that are running a hybrid organization. The planning process is just going to run a lot more smoothly and a lot more seamlessly because the technology is there to support that kind of a dispersed and distributed planning process. One of the reasons we really push this idea of integrated business planning is that our research shows that you get better results from it. And so what our most recent research shows is that companies that have a planning process where all of the the data, the plans, all of that information is directly linked. They have 2/3 of them have a planning process that works well or very well, and that's compared to 40% where that information winds up getting copied into a single view, and I would include in that where you're consolidating a bunch of desktop spreadsheets, and 25% where there's little or no connection. It's just somebody's kind of typing in numbers, that type of thing. So an effective planning process is one that's integrated, one that it supports high participation, it's collaborative, it's action oriented, and it's fast. So, what your thoughts, Rowan, on that?
Yeah, what we saw in the middle of in the pandemic is obviously monthly cycles went to weekly cycles went to daily, and daily cycles went to hourly, right? And I think that that speed with which people needed to operate at that point in time is going to live on. And the demand for those cycle times to have decreased as significantly as they did, and that high frequency decision making is going to live on, especially as we talked about, that the change is going to just keep coming. aside from the pandemic itself, there's going to be this just continuous change in the market. We saw it even beforehand. And so that demand, that need of this cycle times is going to increase. And especially as we may see a much more remote distributed workforce as we talked about.
Yeah, I think one of the enduring benefits of this recent experience is if you have children and they barge into some professional meeting, everybody's just perfectly fine with that.
Well, I'm glad I've got a mute button on my microphone because my kids were going pretty loud before while you were talking. So nice and easy. And so, Rob, in terms of that unification, we talked about it in a remote capacity, right? More specifically around how finance would be able to integrate their processes. But when we think of planning, it's not an individual sport, it's a team sport. And when we think about that in an organization, it's very cross-functional. I mean, the needs of finance to rely upon workforce planning, revenue planning, all sorts of disparate planning activities. How do you see this unifying organizations cross-functionally in a distributed way?
Yeah, so let me bring up this little visual here to make the point that for those of us who spend any time thinking about and observing how companies do their planning and budgeting, the thing is that there's an awful lot of planning going on throughout a company, throughout an organization. You have demand plans being drawn up. You have the supply chain people doing supply chain planning, marketing people doing marketing planning, sales forecasts, revenue forecasts, all of that. There's a lot of planning going on. And then they do a financial plan based on a lot of those plans, which is what we call the budget. Today, most of that kind of integrated plan, it's the budget. And it's a budget that's assembled out of siloed-based individual spreadsheets. So the point of integrated business planning is just that, to break down the silos, to unify the planning process cross-functionally, where you plan just the way you want to plan as a business unit, but the information from other plans is also there to kind of inform what you're planning to do. So to do that, of course, you need to have it all on a single platform. That's where the technology comes in. So one of the things that becomes possible at that point is that for the FP&A organization, what they then can orchestrate is not simply, pulling together a bunch of spreadsheets, but making the information available from one group to another. And so one, perfect example of that is I'm putting together the headcount part of my budget. And here I am, I'm running a factory, and I've got all these people working there. So I've got this headcount thing, and I have to spend an awful lot of time ruminating over what's going to happen to salaries, what's going to happen to employment taxes, is it this percent, that percent, think about all kinds of things that really aren't in my wheelhouse, aren't my area of expertise. Well, wouldn't it just be great if in putting this together, the person running that factory just kind of puts down what's the head count month by month, and then information coming out of the HR organization multiplies that by the whatever rates they've come up with, whatever salaries are going to be, whatever employment tax is going to be, and that generates the budget line items for headcount. That would be something that would very much simplify the process for that factory owner, the factory manager, and it would also probably produce a much more actionable, accurate headcount budget when you apply that across the entire company. So the same thing applies to maybe non-financial things where, say, the marketing organization, it's put together its plan, and its plan involves promotion for a product that begins, this month, this certain month. Well, it would be great if I'm running that factory to know that, in April, they're planning a promotion so that beginning in February, I can start to build up inventories in a way that produces the lowest possible inventory level and lowest manufacturing cost.
As we think about that, Rob, obviously it's really important that to drive this collaborative experience, you have to communicate the strategy really well, right? With all collaboration, communication is probably the most important piece. How should organizations think about that?
Well, I've often, said that planning and budgeting ought to be viewed as a process of a structured dialogue. It's structured because there are numbers involved. It's quantifiable. It's not, oh, well, revenues are going to be up. It's, well, revenues are going to be up by 14%. They'll be up, 6% here and 25% there, and so on. So it's structured, but as important, maybe even more important, it's actually a dialogue. It's a dialogue involving leadership team, executives, managers. So it requires communication between everybody during the planning and budgeting process. And you need to have systems to promote and support just that dialogue. And a dialogue means that the process is collaborative. Collaboration is built on communications to support that dialogue. The reason why it must be collaborative is that, well, just look at what happens if it isn't. If in the end you don't have a sense of collaboration, then I think you wind up with a lack of accountability in how you look at the performance. Because if the process, if the dialogue is cut short, and in the end, the budget is just pushed down to a business unit, and then that business unit is simply going to say, well, that's the finance department budget. That's not my budget. So you really need to have a high degree of collaboration to get a process that works, where there is sufficient buy-in and accountability to make it a useful business process. And again, our research backs that assertion up because what we found is that 85% of companies that collaborate effectively, they have a well-managed planning process, and only 11% of companies that don't have a well-managed process. So I don't mean for this to be a monologue. What do you guys see in your discussions?
Yeah, as we talk to customers, obviously, the collaboration and communication go hand in hand, and the people that do that well generally outperform their competition in whatever way that may be, whether it's, the speed of their planning process, whether it's the integrated nature of their planning processes, or whether it's their compressed cycles. You talked about agility, right? So those companies that are able to do that are much more effective. And that just comes from that collaboration culture where they've leveraged capabilities, whether it be technology or whether it be just internal processes that allow that collaboration to happen. And I would say a lot of that comes from leadership of the organization in terms of how cross-functional they've made their organizations as well. I'm sure if you dug a level deeper into here, you would find a lot of commonality as to the types of leadership and those types of elements that actually correlate really well, and probably are a causation of some of these stats that you've got here, Rob. So obviously what we're talking about here helps with a lot of continuity, business continuity. It helps companies in situations like this really focus on thrive or survive versus the alternatives, especially if they can rapidly adapt to what's going on in the external markets. So how should companies thinking about doing this, making this change, Rob, try and promote that readiness or get ready to do something like this?
Well, let's go back to the point that it isn't just about black swan events. Mm-hmm. Having this capability to do rapid contingency planning means that your planning cycles generally are going to be a lot faster. And it isn't just about sort of the edge events. It's about dealing with everyday business. I mean, you mentioned tariffs. You mentioned any number of things. And what often comes to my mind is pilots train in simulators, and it's not just so that they can handle in-flight emergencies that happen once in a million times. It's there to build up muscle memory to deal with the stuff that's just a bit out of the ordinary. Being able to, we all know how to do this. We've worked together in cockpits. We've simulated this event, this piece of equipment getting knocked out. You just want to be able to be in the mindset that I'm ready for anything, not I've got 3 scenarios that are pretty much tops down and pretty much just numbers oriented. So, I think you want to be able to have the ability to do that kind of, rapid scenario planning, have a process that's built for agility and built for people to collaborate and communicate very rapidly as they build and rebuild plans and budgets. The point I would make there is what we found in our research is, and I don't want to be tedious about ragging on spreadsheets all the time. Spreadsheets are absolutely essential. I've been using them for 40 years, but they're not always the right technology, and sometimes they really do get in the way. And I think that's true in planning and budgeting. Dedicating planning software, in our research, it just works better. 2/3 of the companies in our recent Office of Finance research, benchmark research, said that those that use a dedicated planning application had a process that works well. But only 36% of companies that use spreadsheets can say that. I will, that was done last year. I bet if I asked that question right now, I'd get a very different answer, where that 36% might actually be quite a bit lower. So, so continuity and readiness is I think, absolutely essential in pandemic times, but also when things go back to what we used to call normal.
Yeah, and I would say it's not just the technology that supports that. It's the mindset that those companies have approached. And your pilot analogy was a good one. If you think about the mindset of airlines and pilot training, it's one of continuous improvement. Every time there's something that happens, very minor, right? We have black boxes in a plane to diagnose and try and fix any issues that may or may not happen, and they have a culture of continuous improvement all the time. And I think that's the important aspect here is, the software, and I have to say this is obviously important, but I think it's the culture and the vision that organizations are trying to create that is actually more important, and trying to really be that continuous improvement organization across the enterprise is a huge factor as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Oops.
And so this begs the question: what's holding people back from kind of becoming that strategic partner, becoming that continuous improvement organization?
Well, I could spend another half an hour talking about this, but we're over time here, so let me be very brief. I think if I look at some of the proximate causes, is that a lot of finance organizations are too busy fighting fires to be strategic. There's all the little day-to-day stuff that occupies everybody's time. And there's not time left over to step back and say, well, let's change things, let's make things different. Well, I'd love to, but I'm too busy to figure out how to save time. And then I think also, it's there's within finance organizations, changing something that's kind of risky, and people tend to be a bit risk averse there in finance organizations. But I think to get back to an important point you made earlier just now is there needs to be leadership. This is very much a question of change management. And change management means that starting from the top down, and I mean the CEO and the CFO, they're in agreement that the planning and budgeting has to fundamentally change. It's possible to do that. The technology is there, but before that can have any impact, the willingness to change has to be there. And finance, the FP&A organization, for its part, I think the FP&A organization needs to be thinking more outside in about what its role is. I think they need to serve the rest of the organization in a very active way, not just be stewards of a budgeting process, but actively enabling the rest of the organization to plan and budget much more efficiently, make it more action-oriented.
Absolutely. And I know we've got a statistic here that says 9 out of 10 execs want their finance organization to be a strategic partner. I won't question the motivations of that 1 out of 10 executive, but the key concern I would have, given what we've seen happen over the last 18 months is this last section of this quote here, which is fewer than 25% will actually evolve into this role. And that really leads me on to my next question, which is, if that's the case, how can we prove that fact wrong? What can organizations do today, now, Rob, to actually, move the needle here?
Yeah, well, I certainly hope that this is a cloudy crystal ball, and that, in fact, as a result of what's just happened, that we do see a much higher percentage evolving into that role. But I guess my skepticism is that change is difficult. What can people, when I'm watching this dialogue, do? Well, I think pretty much laying down a vision, trying to sell a vision of what planning and budgeting ought to be, of being able to demonstrate that change is possible, that it entails limited risk, that there are real operational business benefits to changing how businesses plan and budget, that those changes actually will make the process faster and much more useful to the participants in the planning and budgeting process than what they have today. So that in the end, there's something in it for everyone. Something for the CEO who can now see an integrated plan and changes to that integrated plan based on contingencies extremely rapidly, if not instantly. Mm-hmm. Who can ask questions, well, what if this happens, and get an answer. For the CFO, who can get an integrated income statement, balance sheet, and cash flow forecast that's backed by some level of detail. And for the budget owners themselves, or the business owners, what they can have is a planning process that gives them much more useful feedback about their performance. So that, in a very large nutshell, is what I think can move the needle.